Imagine for a moment that you are a road-weary traveler. You're tired, you're hungry, and wondering if there will ever be a safe place to rest. You've been told there's an outpost ahead that provides safety, information for the road ahead, and people who understand what the journey is like. You keep scanning the horizon, hoping against hope that it will be there. Then as you come over a rise in the terrain, you suddenly catch a glimpse of it. There it stands, beckoning you to come and find the rest you need. You're moments away from the outpost. Well, greetings and welcome everybody to another edition of the Outpost Podcast. I am Dr. Ray Mitch, your host. I am so glad to take some time that you have taken some time out of your busy schedule to listen in and to join me for a brief moment in time to consider our relationships, our relationship with God, and what that all looks like, and how does that impact the other aspects of our relationship. So if you're wondering, if you've listened to tuned in or dialed up, whatever the word is for that, to listen to this podcast, the Outpost is a digital gathering place more than anything, where we're trying to build bridges back to faith for some, strengthen the bridges of faith for others, and ultimately, it is all built entirely on authenticity and grace and truth, and knowing and being known are the three key values of this effort to build bridges back to faith, and all that goes along with that. Let's put it that way. So, my hope is to create a space where the doubters and wounded, the confused and beat up and beat down, the bent and bruised who feel like their lives are a disappointment to God can feel accepted enough to be known and know others. Now, obviously, this is a one-way communication, but the effort here is to challenge us to move into two-way communications with a variety of people in our lives and try to figure that out. So I want to be a place where people can meet and bump into the biblical Jesus as he is, not as they have been told he is, or whatever their caricature of him is. And that ties directly into the kind of relationships that we cultivate in what I'm referring to at this point as the Outpost. An outpost is a outgrowth or a expression of the ministry of Stained Glass International. It is a nonprofit whose sole purpose is to attempt to invite Gen Z and the next generation of Christians back into conversation, back into dialogue with, I don't know if it's those in the church, but with people that authentically really want to move into their lives and hear what their experiences have been like in the church and with Christians, and perhaps write a different script and find a way to heal from some of the woundedness that comes out of that. And I can tell you it hasn't been really all that long when I have been even in a situation where I heard somebody say to another person, well, if you're not going to go to church, then you can't come here anymore. And I was stunned. I was stunned to hear the thought that reaction between somebody and another person in regards to a group which may have been their really only, their real only contact with conversation about life in Christ and living life authentically, all the things that I just mentioned. So what I have started on is a series here on the Outpost podcast, and what I'm focusing on is if we imagine that the Outpost is actually a place where we can gather and get inspiration and maybe get some clarity and challenge about 6 key dimensions of relationship that I think are important to consider within this digital outpost that I'm referring to. And so last time we took some time to talk about truth and how we handle truth, and how perhaps one way to think about it is to consider it in terms of big T truth, which is universal to everybody. It's the truth that God has revealed himself with, and how to live life best, and what kinds of ways we can connect with one another, and how we can connect with him or even reconnect with him. And so we looked at that, and then we also looked at what I have referred to as small t truth. And small t truth is just simply the truth that is unique to me. Now, in a lot of cases, if we don't look, we don't have anything to talk about when it comes to the small t truth. But the reality is, small t truth is the very nature of who we are. It's the stuff that we're made of, our hopes and fears and disappointments and discouragements and excitement and things that really get our motor running, and that we get pumped about, and the things that really knock a hole and hit us in the gut, whatever that might be, and being able to talk about that. But that's little t truth. That's not universal to everybody. It's unique only to me. And there is passages in Scripture that make it very clear, but in Proverbs in particular, where my joy and my despair are really only known by me, and the only way that anyone else can know anything about it is by me revealing that to you or to them. So that's the first dimension. Ultimately, everything starts with truth and how we handle truth, not only the universal truth, like I said in that example just a minute ago, but also how do we handle our own personal small t truth, not big T truth. The key to understand the interaction between those, as I mentioned last time, is that oftentimes we mismatch the use of truth in our relationships with other people. So when they take the time to reveal to us a small t reality of what's going on within them, and we pull out a big T truth to apply to it, the person basically walks away feeling misunderstood, unheard, and really ends up equating that with, that's how God handles me, is by how Christians that are presumably are walking with God, that's how God handles me, is how they handle me, and how they handle the truth that I'm trying to display, or not display, but communicate. So truth is a key element, I think, in our relationships. It is the thing that we oftentimes fight over. And it's usually oftentimes a fight over small t realities, the things, how I see things versus how you see things, and how unique that is to each of us. So that's the first dimension that I think we have to contend with. It is the basis of everything that comes hereafter in terms of the dimensions. So I mentioned, I think, getting into it, that the way that I see this, and if I had asked myself the question early in my career that has now spanned 4 decades, that if I were to boil down all the things that I talk to people about, and I have talked to people about, they end up boiling down to 6 key dimensions. And I believe these 6 key dimensions are very much critical to understanding the kind of community we tend to create, or the kind of community that we might be a part of. And just remember, oftentimes we think of community in terms of something we can be a part of, rather than that I actually have a hand in developing community just in my relationship with other people. So truth always comes into play. And the one thing I'd have you remember about all that I said last time was, a mistimed truth is experienced as a weapon by the other person. So when I pull out a big T truth to apply to a little t reality or a little t truth that somebody's trying to communicate, they will feel entirely misunderstood and oftentimes will feel attacked. Because essentially what we're saying is your little t truth doesn't matter. What only matters is the big T truth. Now, I am not saying that big T truth is bad or that it shouldn't be used, but Peter makes it pretty clear, I believe, in his letters, for 1st and 2nd Peter, that our truth should be shared in season and out. In season being connected to the person and their need, not my need to communicate whatever it is I believe I should. And so big T truth, little t truth is very important, I think, to consider. Like I said, it is an arbitrary way to try to understand the differences between our personal subjective truth and objective truth that God makes very clear to us in His Word and through Jesus and through the people that have been poured into, that have written a lot of the Scripture. And that's worth paying attention to. But we have to find a way for that to intersect with our little t worlds. And that's where life often is lived, is the intersection between the big T realities that God says, this is the best way to live, this is how things are, versus how I experience them. And I don't have to dismiss my experience of them in order for me to grasp God's portrayal and revealing of how life should be. And that should be isn't an imposition. It's saying this is how life is best lived. Choose, just choose. And if I choose wrongly, I probably will. I do regularly. But if I'm free to choose. And if I choose that and choose to move toward what is the best for me, then I will reap certain consequences. If I don't choose, I will reap certain consequences. That is an absolute truth. It is as sure as gravity is that we will reap a consequence of whatever our choices might be. So there's that, and that's the first one that I wanted to take some time to talk a little bit about. The second dimension that I think is even more important and has even greater impact on our relationships is to answer the question, so why do we play God in people's lives? Why do we play God? And really, quite honestly, the short answer is because we don't trust Him. Or we don't trust anyone else, really. Ironically, there are various things that we don't trust ourselves with. So we live in a world that we don't trust anyone. We say, and I might say, we rhapsodize about trusting God, but when push comes to shove, we don't trust Him, and our choices betray us in that regard. There is an axiom, if you will, that I hold to, and I say all the time, I say it so frequently that my students, I think, probably have nightmares about it. And the axiom is this, or it's an aphorism. It's control and trust cannot coexist. And so if I trust somebody, I will seek to give them freedom to choose whatever they see fit, whether I like it or not, if I'm going to trust them. But if I don't trust them, then I'm going to do everything I can to control them. And if I find myself engaging in controlling behavior, which we'll talk about, if I find myself engaging in that, then by implication, by conclusion, I don't trust them. And there's a lot of ways that we spend to control outcomes and control other people. We don't see it that way. And I would never really expect anybody to do that. But control and trust cannot coexist in a relationship. And ironically, in our relationship with God, even, it tends to weasel its way in there in terms of how we try to manage God's reaction to us by our demands, by our good behavior, by any number of things, whatever that might look like for you. So that's the start of it, okay? The thing to keep in mind here is if we're going to have a relationship that has vulnerability in it, vulnerability requires trust, and trust requires vulnerability. They are mutually connected to one another, and they interact connectedly in a sense. So if my trust is diminishing, then I'm probably not going to be very vulnerable. And if I want a relationship that is going to have vulnerability in it, then I'm going to have to trust. And it's really, really hard. It's harder than we think, honestly. And if we're committed to control, we will avoid vulnerability and talk about its value, but we will still avoid vulnerability. So vulnerability, and just to give you a little background, it comes from the Latin word vulnerare or vulneros, which means capable of being wounded. So essentially, being vulnerable, and I think we all know this intuitively, is I'm opening myself to being wounded. On the other hand, I'm also opening myself to being loved, because ultimately the soul of love is vulnerability. So what I want to spend a little time talking about is how we play God. And the way that we go about doing this is whenever we try to control our image and how we're perceived by other people. And it is so embedded in us that we don't even notice when it's happening at all. And it's something that I will probably talk about at some later point in time that I oftentimes refer to as a stained glass self. I've created an image. If you think about a stained glass has an image on it, oftentimes telling a story, but behind it, you never are able to see what's behind it. And that's how we handle our image. We create an image for people to consume, but we're safely invulnerable behind it, and yet we're showing a very different picture. So we try to control our image. We try to control how other people and what they think or conclude about us. And a lot of times it's stealing choices from them, which again, we'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute here. But it's stealing choices from them. It's saying, I don't trust you to make the choice to stay connected to me or not leave me or see me in a good light. And so I'm going to give you just enough information so that you conclude the right way, which isn't a ruse. It is a collusion between two parties. And a collusion is a secret handshake. It's kind of like a secret agreement that is unseen. Because essentially what we're doing is we're saying, I'll do it, and I know you're going to do it, and I'll honor yours, and you honor mine. And that's how we go about controlling things. And so we try to control what people think. We try to control what people conclude. We manage our perceptions of others and how they see us and all of those sorts of things. And the thing is that we really can't imagine a world where we are free enough just to be ourselves and let other people conclude as they see fit. Part of it is that we live in the perceptions of other people. And so if we manage those perceptions, then our image remains intact. And that's, again, playing God. I think we all know that we don't have the control to do that. If I conduct a poll anywhere on CCU's campus or anywhere else I might be and say, can you control what people think? 99, if not 100 out of 100 people will say, no, of course not. I have no power over that. And yet, just check how much of our day is spent managing what other people think about us, what we show, how we talk, what we refer to, all of those things. And so we have a variety of ways that we go about playing God. Another place that we control things is our problems specifically, and again, how they are perceived. And so we oftentimes will refuse to see problems or shortcomings because they make us what? Vulnerable, and we don't trust people. And so I don't want somebody to see those things. Now, listen, the issue isn't just let it all hang out and let the chips fall where they may. No, that is not what I'm saying. People in our lives need to earn our trust. It is not readily given, and neither should it be. And just understand that a lot of times we invest trust in someone in order to try to get them to become the trustworthy person we wish they would be. And it rarely happens. It rarely happens. There's this kind of phenomenon, if you will, in statistics where it's always reverting back to the mean, back to the average. And that's true with people too. They will always revert back to how they've always done things, the default of how they do things. And so we see problems to be fixed and neutralized rather than problems to be grown through and insight gained into not only ourselves, but also how we relate and what that looks like. So the other big one that I want to mention is how we play God is by how we manage our pain. And we're living in a time where I think we are, we do everything we can to maximize our happiness, and I'm using that word very intentionally, and minimizing our discomfort. And in some quarters and in some places that I've talked to people, discomfort is the equivalent of pain. But I would suggest to you that not all pain is bad, because pain can indicate certainly destruction. I mean, last spring I had a really bad knee, and it was bone on bone, and the pain indicated that I had no ligaments left in there, or no cushioning for my knee anymore. And that was an indication that destruction had occurred and something had to happen. What was the key element that indicated to me that I was healing was, guess what? The pain was not there anymore. That was the indication. So pain is an indicator of destruction or of healing, or it could indicate healing and growth. Sometimes we get pain from growing, and if we make the conclusion that all pain is bad, then when we're growing, we are going to say that's a bad thing, when in fact it's part of growth. And I can tell you from watching and supervising counselors in training, pain is part of growth. It's very uncomfortable to make changes and to evaluate the choices that we make, even as a counselor, in listening to people and how I go about helping them as part of that. So that's the second one. And then the third one is pain it's just expected and normal. It's part of the journey. And again, 2 out of the 3 of these are all part of life and living. That's pain. And you say, well, good grief, that's really discouraging if life is pain. And yeah, but I would also add perspective is everything here. Because we have to discern, is it destruction or is it growth and part of the journey that I'm on in terms of dealing with life and dealing with relationships. Probably people bail out of relationships when there's relational pain too soon, because they say pain indicates the oncoming destruction, when they can't predict that. But that's what their experiences have been. So pain is key to understand, and it's one of the things that we do everything we can to really control how it looks, how we experience it, everything about it. And again, I'm not making a case for being a masochist. And pain is good. It's always good. Let's get more. No, I'm not saying that at all. But it is very much a part of the landscape of how we go about controlling. And I'd simply say outcomes. Is I predict what an outcome will be, and I will do everything I can to make sure that that outcome doesn't happen, or I predict a desired outcome, and I do everything I can to make sure that it does happen. And I have to steal things in order to make that possible. So now let me jump on probably about 10 of them of the what I call the anatomy of control and the thoughts we entertain in order to make this happen. The first one, for example, is a commitment to performance and task completion versus relationship and connection. And sometimes we can be so driven to get something done and have a certain level of performance that we forget all about the relationships and connecting with people and everybody growing. And so we get so focused on getting it done that relationships suffer. And so here's a great quote from somebody. It goes this way: when I'm working on a project, I often become so focused that I get irritated when someone interrupts me, and I tend to snap at them. See, the focus is on getting the project done and without concern for the impact that it has on the people around me and how I handle that. And that's not to say that getting tasks done is wrong. There's a funny thing that happens whenever I talk about this stuff, and some of it is how people tend to put it in very black and white terms. Either it's good or it's bad. And what I'm saying is that you shouldn't try to strive and achieve and produce a good put forth a good product for people. I'm not saying that at all. But when the production of that product is more important than the relationships that I am trying to manage within that, that's when the problem comes in. Now, the second one is I'm uncomfortable with ideas that are different than mine. And a lot of times it's insecurity. When somebody has a different idea than I do or a different way of looking at something, and I tend to attack that idea because it is different than mine, and mine, we all know, right, is the right one. And so in a lot of ways, it seems like the whole idea that somebody would have a different thought or a different way of looking at it becomes a threat to our authority or even our validity as a person, because that diminishes me when somebody has a different opinion. Now, I think we can say kind of in the abstract, no, of course not. I mean, somebody can have a different opinion. But the more invested we become in a lot of these things, the more threat it becomes when somebody has a differing idea or a different opinion than we do. And the challenge is how do I remain open to it instead of shutting it down because my ideas are so much a part of who I am that if I feel like I'm giving up a part of me to entertain another possibility, and that's always hard to do. So I'm uncomfortable with ideas that are different than mine. Another one, I try to control as much of my life and people in it as possible. And this is that controlling of things in our lives to such a degree that we end up being manipulative, we get bossy, we escalate and kind of power up on people because they're challenging the way that we want to get something done or whatever that might be. And sometimes we'll even give unsolicited advice to people when they haven't really asked for our advice. And it's, in a sense, trying to get them to behave how we think they should and key word there, should. So I try to control as much of my life and the people in it as I can. And that's where some of the problem comes in. So that's the obvious. The manipulations, the bossiness, the escalating, all of that is very obvious. There's more subtle ways that we go about controlling our life and people in it, like the silent treatment, otherwise known as withdrawal, or ignoring advice, or procrastinating and giving weak excuses why I was late on something. You know, it's interesting how pointed being late on something is sometimes, is that we don't value what it is that we've been told we maybe should do. And so we get it done, we do it, but then we're late, or we procrastinate on it and do a haphazard job and offer up a weak excuse, or we're just quietly uncooperative. Now, a lot of times people will call that being passive aggressive. But the interesting thing about that is technically it is and it isn't. I mean, we are so quick to label stuff. And for me, that I have lived in the world of mental health for so long, it kind of puts my teeth a little on edge when people are too quick on the trigger to label something as, for example, passive aggressive. Well, if you had ever interacted with somebody that was truly passive aggressive, you probably wouldn't pull that card out that quick, because I can dig my heels in and just resist passively, and that would be that. The aggressive part is what others often feel, is they feel that there's a certain anger in our passiveness, and to some degree, you're right, but that's a very common thing that we characterize it as. And in the clinical realm, yes and no, it's not quite to that level, but it is still, it makes the point, right? That when the person resists, we know that there's a message in there, even though you point it out to them and they'll end up saying, I have no idea what you're talking about, which allows them to really stay safe and looking good, even though they're getting away with poking at us or saying or being what I want to say, obstructive in whatever we are. Here's another one. I often feel the drive to do something because it's my duty and obligation. Now, let me clarify something for you, and also make a credit here. There's a lot of this that I'm walking through that it comes out of a book of a colleague of mine many years ago, David Carter, and the book isn't called Imperative People, and he talks at length about this controlling nature that we have. So it'll be in the notes for the podcast, and if you're interested, I sure encourage you to get your hands on that. Now, the item that I just mentioned is the drive to do something because it's my duty and obligation. What we have to do is to clarify what's the difference between commitment versus obligation. Because if I'm committed to doing something, then I'm going to make a free choice to do whatever it is that I'm committed to do, whether that's visiting a friend who's sick or doing something kind for somebody that is not even noticed. That's out of a commitment to showing grace and showing love to them. And that's a free choice. Obligation, on the other hand, is a forced activity. In a lot of cases, obligation is used to rob us of our choice. And, you know, it comes up a lot of times in even family relationships where we feel obliged to do something, and it's that we don't have a choice, or it's our duty to do something and we don't have a choice. Now, I can frame it in a variety of ways to say, well, I choose to do it even though it is my duty to do it, whatever that is. But ultimately, if I'm going to have a duty to do something, at some point I have made a choice to make it my duty to do something. But obligation is put in such a way that we really don't have any other choice but to be obligated to do what it is the person is asking us to do, or we do it ourselves. And we understand that the person feels obliged, for whatever reason, and they end up doing it that way. So another one, it's difficult for me to admit my weaknesses, flaws, and shortcomings. And in a lot of cases, what we find is people will say, you're never wrong. That you never have anything that you make a mistake about, or you admit that you make a mistake on. And ultimately, the person is trying to write an ideal script for his or her life, and that will never include the ugly side of our nature, that we do it wrong, say it wrong, we're insensitive, we're selfish in a lot of ways, but we cover it up and we deflect responsibility onto someone else. And so one of the places that we expose and manage outcomes and how we're perceived is in this handling our own weaknesses and flaws and shortcomings. The interesting thing about it, that is, even when you go into Scripture, is that Paul had what he referred to as a thorn in the flesh. And he finally got to a point as he was writing the letter to the Corinthians, the Corinthian church, he finally got to the point to saying, I will boast in my weaknesses and flaws, not specifically those words, because God's power is seen in my weakness. And so we tend to see weaknesses in terms of how it will impact somebody else's perception of us. And so we hide it because, again, we're back to managing someone else's perceptions of us. So another one, thoughts. I don't like my emotions or others to get out of control. Now, this one's interesting in the sense that what does out of control mean? Intense? The one thing that I've seen happen over and over again, because the other world that I live in and talk about is grief, is how often when somebody has tears, however they look, whether they're crying or whatever it is, they automatically apologize for it. And that's their own imposition of, I don't want to fall apart. I don't want to get out of control. I don't want anything to make someone else uncomfortable. And ultimately, we're committed to keeping very, very tight control over all emotions. And Brene Brown makes mention of this when she talks about numbing, that it's a package deal, that when we shut down one emotion, we end up shutting them all down. And it may not be entirely shutting them down, but it makes them duller, and just more tamped down and less intense. And some of that, again, is I don't want somebody to think that I'm falling apart. Well, you lose somebody to death, or you lose something like you lose a job, or you lose a relationship, or whatever that is. It's not a matter of falling apart. More than anything, it's more a matter of embracing the fullness of how I actually feel. So it's actually falling together, not falling apart. So emotions and others, and you see a lot of people sometimes get very, very uncomfortable when people have some very intense emotions, understandably, but some of it is because they feel helpless and they feel like they should do something, when in fact it's the other person's emotions. We need to get out of the way and let them feel it, because that's an important part of expressing ourselves, is our emotions. Another kind of way of thinking is I get irritated when other people make mistakes, and some of that is because we see their mistakes as a reflection on us. And so we end up entertaining kind of idealistic expectations of ourselves and others. And in this case, then, frailties and flaws are despised. And so our frustration boils over when others or ourselves don't perform at whatever the expected level is. Now, understand something about our expectations. We tend to underestimate the power of our expectations. And I have said many times before, oftentimes, we don't know what those expectations are until they go unmet. And that's certainly the case with this particular kind of thought process, is that we have an expectation of how somebody is to perform, what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to say it, all of those sorts of things. And then when that doesn't happen, then our frustration boils over and we get irritated with them. So that's just a sampling. That's not an exhaustive list by any means, but that's a sampling of the thoughts that go into managing other people's perceptions of us, managing their behavior, and to some degree stealing choices away from them by not offering enough information for them to make those choices. And so we get our desired outcome, whatever that might be. So those are just a few thoughts. Now, what about the feelings? Because there's plenty of feelings that drive these thoughts that we have to look at. For example, one of them is anger. Now, most people would agree that anger is a secondary emotion, that really anger is a cover for fear. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. I think, again, it ends up, our anger gets built on my demand that others conform to my expectations. And so anger is, in a sense, a cover for, I'm afraid that things are going to fly out of control and I won't be able to handle it, or I won't be able to manage it, or whatever that would be. So anger certainly is one that drives these things. Another one is fear, as I've already mentioned. A lot of times we don't want to admit this, but oftentimes our fear gets translated into defensiveness and accusations, and that shows up in the context of our relationships as well. And then another one is just denial. We refuse to admit what the truth really is, and ultimately we end up rejecting our own humanness. And I have jokingly said to too many people, and usually I end up having to duck because they a lot of times want to clock me, is welcome to being human, because we see our humanness as a liability rather than just a fundamental part of who we are. And so a lot of times we end up being evasive and hiding our humanness, if you will, and avoiding contact in a lot of ways. And ultimately, that's another way that we go about handling the emotions of that, is that we punish people by our absence. And our absence can be withdrawal, or it can be our literal absence by leaving the room. I will point out to you that in a lot of cases, if you're in a tense discussion with somebody, they get mad and they storm out of the room and slam the door shut, they are just engaging in what I would call terminal control. They manage the outcome of the situation by ending it. And so they control the outcome that way. And so we get caught in that. And then one other emotion I want to kind of highlight is worry. And interesting, worry, the old English definition means to strangle or to give pain. And it's a feeling of apprehension or distress or uneasiness that ultimately is focused on the future and some future predicted event. And so essentially what we end up doing is strangling our view of the future through worry. And it's what I often refer to as ruminating. We go over and over and over something in our head, and it usually is built around some anticipated event that we have predicted, and we react to it as if it has actually happened. So there's worry, and then, of course, shame, which is based entirely on a threat to my identity and my sense of belonging and connectedness to other people. And that's percolating in the background in everything we do in so many ways. And that would be an entire other episode. And I would point you to listen to one of the Blast from the Past episode earlier this month, or in August, I believe, that where I'm talking about the comfort of shame, because it's just always there, and it's so much there that we've gotten relatively comfortable with it. So now let me land the plane here. So what is the antidote to control? And I would suggest to you there are three key things if we want to try to dismantle our drive to controlling for certain outcomes. And it's choice and freedom and cultivating humility are the three. Choice, it empowers the other person to choose for him or herself. And when we're committed to choice, we expand the choices of the other. We don't constrict them to get our desired outcome. And the thing I would point out to you is that I believe that God actually is committed to our choice. That's exactly why he sent his son to die for us. Because he said, look, I'll pay the price for you. Now you choose. And I desire for you to choose me and a relationship with me. And I make that possible through my son, Jesus. And that's what choice is. It is a key value that we cultivate in expanding other people's choices, expanding their freedom, and putting a priority on relationships and allowing people to choose for themselves. And it's actually allowing them to be who they are. And they don't need our permission for that, but it's important to do that. And then lastly, cultivating humility, which is built on a realistic appraisal of myself that is not built on shame. Now that's a real tall order, because like I said, we are marinating in shame. We don't even know how it operates in our in terms of how we relate to people, how we relate to ourselves. Even I would go so far as to point out how we relate to God himself. And so we have to cultivate an acknowledgement of my own limitations and not add shame into it, and choose to be guided by a modest sense of self-importance. And self-importance sounds bad in and of itself, right? But there's some benefits to us in our confidence in how God has gifted us, how God has, what experiences he's brought us through. And those things are, I have something to offer. Not better than anybody else, not more important than anybody else, but I do have something to offer. And ultimately, I have the thing that I'm pointing to here is self-acceptance that is based entirely in grace. And that's a whole other conversation, because essentially grace creates the space for me to grow and to change. Shame does not. It might change my behavior in the short term, but it's still in the short term. And the self-acceptance is based in grace is very key for us to understand, and to and to ultimately empower us to accentuate the choices, accentuate the freedom of other people that are around us. So that's a little bit of that dimension in our relationships with other people, and even in our relationship with ourselves. I mean, a lot of times the over-controlling nature leads to perfectionism in ourselves, and then we end up getting pretty discouraged pretty quickly, because nothing ever goes the way that we had expected it or anticipated or predicted. And because of that, then we see ourselves as a failure, and now we're back to shame again. So plenty of food for thought there. It may take some time to what I want to say, absorb it all. But in the meantime, you can visit us at sgi-net.org. That is our home for the SGI community. And if you have any questions or anything, you can feel free to DM me on Instagram or at SG International at I think that's right. SG International on Instagram. And so you can DM me there, or you can just hit the website at sgi-net.org. And there's a contact form at the bottom of the front page, the home page. And I can also refer or respond to it that way as well. So please subscribe, be a part of for us on the podcast as well as on the website, and join our community. As soon as you hit the homepage, you'll get hit up for joining the community, and you'll get our periodic emails and updates of retreats that are going on and the devotionals and other things like that. I will mention that I started up another podcast called Unscripted. That's also part of SGI Media, and it's called That Unscripted Collected Wisdom of Life, Living in Sorrow. And I am just allowing an inside look into the journey through sorrow after I lost a dear friend back in March. So there's that. Like I said, you can find us on 3 different social media outlets: Instagram at SGI_international, Facebook, Stained Glass International, and then at LinkedIn and DR Mitch. And you can find us in any of those places. Whatever podcast platform you use to listen, you can find us in any one of those places. If you're interested in partnering with us, thank you so much. We are having to grow a scholarship fund for people that want to participate in our silent retreats that we put on. And so we have one coming up this fall for CCU students, and another one in the spring. My hope would be to have other ones in the summer that we would be able to scholarship people to be able to go. All of your gifts and donations are tax deductible, and so you can donate on the web page at the drop-down menu, or you can send us a check if you so desire at the SGI. The address is P.O. Box 322, East Lake, Colorado, 80614. There's lots of other things on the website, including my newest book, Seasons of Our Grief, that you can find on the website to be able to purchase. And I think that is it for tonight. If that wasn't enough, there's all sorts of other things, but I'm not going to go into it now. So thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate your time and your participation in listening and considering some of the things that we're talking about as far as the dimensions of redemptive community and what we're referring to as the outpost for the heart. So until next time, I will see you. I'll be here waiting for you, and love you later.